Vice President of the European Universities Association, Professor Martin Graher, President of NUI Galway, distinguished guests, fellow scholars and friends. If I might begin for just a few moments in one of the oldest languages of Europe and a working language of the community, my own language, Irish. Is min la mawicus sa gawal, la lacht agrathe na cogoile sha as an cuidir queen a hiolshit am a vein o'r masker modgen, agus is múr an pleasure dom hei fólse ara roiv ga gailliv, agus ach go hoirithe go hilsgil na gaillive, agus an deisha ve am laurtliv, tauchi na nulsgilline, fuinas a flé, agus fuinas dat sa suki a flé. So tugan sé ácha special to dom énuair, dar no I filler in alskel in a hosse me mar dalton hysterit and privily dom feather mar muntor ulskelja. Continuing in our second working language, English. May I thank the organisers for your conference, for your invitation to be with you this morning. It's a very great pleasure, as I've said, to welcome you to Galway and to have the opportunity to address you on the theme of the future of our universities and their position in a rapidly changing society. It's always a great pleasure for me, of course, to be back here where I began so long ago as a student and where I taught for so many years, which was a great privilege to be a university teacher. I'm delighted to have the opportunity of welcoming the European Universities Association here to Ireland. You're here in Ireland as an association for the first time. I think you have chosen very well to put yourselves on the periphery of Europe, but I think someplace that has quite a global connection. As a critical forum as well in these times for the discussion of European Union policies on higher education, research and innovation, the European University Association is an essential component of our shared intellectual infrastructure. Your conference and the further discussions it will no doubt initiate and inspire, and I so hope that it does, are concerned with issues of great importance to the Europe that we have now, a Europe in conditions of great change. Thus, to the Irish people, as part of Europe as well, you are most welcome to Galway and indeed to Ireland. It's a great privilege to be President of Ireland, and it is a responsibility too to take the opportunity of discussing the circumstances in which we find ourselves in Europe. As a nation, Ireland has an ancient, and I'm pleased to say, contemporary connection to the traditions of European scholarship, and thus the historical intellectual roots from which the very idea of Europe itself grew. For example, in the long history of the Irish people, we dedicate a special place to those Irish monks who helped preserve a heritage of learning in Europe during what is referred to as the Dark Ages. We are especially proud of scholars such as Columbanus, who placed a high value on the study of texts, reflection and meditation, and who went on to establish many flourishing centres of learning in Europe at a time when the written word itself was in dramatic decline. We're also a country that has had experienced colonization, where, as you know, the suggestion of the colonization project is to suggest that those colonized often lack the capacity for abstract thought. Hence my reference, if you like, to the ancient background that is associated with, not just with myth, but the scholarship based on it. I think, if you like, the lives and the scholarship of Columbanus and his colleagues, with their emphasis on knowledge and scholarly learning, shone through a darkened Europe where the fall of the Roman Empire had led to economic and political fracturing. That led not just to a loss of learning, but to a deep hostility to the practice of scholarship itself. I think today, Columbanus is recognized as one of the very earliest European visionaries. A visionary whose cultural influence in Europe during a dark period of its history has been enormous. And in the words of the French statesman Robert Schuman, around the founding moments of the European Union, Schuman referred to him as the patron saint of all those who now seek to build a united Europe. So it is in the spirit of Columbanus and his colleagues then that I welcome you to Ireland as the current custodians of that heritage of European scholarship and intellectual life. I so wish you well in the responsibilities that you carry, for ensuring that universities and the life of scholars and students within them will be visionary, liberating, capable of allowing flourishing lives, and that what is visionary is not only made possible, but that in your universities it will be privileged. Today, the challenges for those entrusted with our institutions of learning are, of course, quite different from the times of Columbanus, and I commend the European Universities Association for facilitating a contemporary-wide exploration on the challenges facing Europe's universities as they develop strategies to adapt at a time of great change. And the issue, of course, is in coming to understand and influence that change. The dedication of this year's annual conference to the digital campus then has a strategic significance. Supporting the exchange of knowledge and the pooling of expertise, this will enable us to collectively forge a future in which knowledge exchange will increasingly be routine rather than occasional. The breadth of the programme for the conference, which I looked at yesterday, provides an opportunity for discussion about the uses and impact of technology on each of the three core aims. There are many more, but there are core aims of higher education: teaching and learning, research and engagement. I'm very, very well aware as well of the exciting opportunities made possible by digitalization, which can be seized, if you like. I have looked at the contribution already of Lord David Putnam, who will be in communication with you from Skibbereen in the southwest, himself emphasizing a point as to the reach of digitalization. In exploring the many facets of these issues, this conference will allow the opportunity, of course, to hear from specialists like him, as well as from practitioners. It will also provide opportunities to hear how colleagues across Europe have set about utilizing technology to enhance provision in these three areas of teaching, research and engagement, as well as, of course, you're having the opportunity, as I've just learned, to hear about the work of the National University of Ireland, Galway itself, which is well worthwhile. There can be no doubt that recent decades have witnessed a significant revolution in higher education and unprecedented change in both its reach and its diversity. It has been a dynamic process, at least as radical as those in the 19th century, when the concept of the research university developed, fundamentally changing the nature of the university. It is my sincerest hope that we can embrace the possibilities of the new instruments of information acquisition without losing the independent, reflective, intellectual atmosphere of the traditional universities. But if we are to achieve that balance to which the President refers, we must first recognize what is essential and timeless in the resource we possess in our universities, as social institutions and as intellectual infrastructure for future generations, which, rather than being seen merely as centers of production for what I refer to as the human resources of an economic system of the current period that may be undergoing the deepest change, but whose fundamental character we are missing through the narrow focus of a scholarship that concentrates on its description and its consequences rather than its essential elements. At the heart of our universities, at their very essence, are certain functions that must be certain guarantees that lead to functions that must be recognized and protected if our embrace of new technology is to enhance rather than undermine this rich heritage we have inherited, and from which all of us benefited. There surely is intellectual satisfaction, I suggest, even excitement, in the symmetries that are made possible by seeing science and its technological applications through the prism of normative, moral, and socially engaged thought. That should encourage us to see the value of philosophy and the integration of scholarship. I feel this is somewhat under threat so widely across Europe. In saying this, I fully recognize that the digital age has undoubtedly brought and delivered to us many advantages for scholars, including, for example, valuable opportunities to protect and preserve and communicate important aspects of our heritage and history. As President of Ireland recently, I saw this for myself. The impact of new technology on historical research was illustrated for me at the presentation of the 1916 oral history collection to the National Library of Ireland. We in Ireland are currently marking the 100th anniversary of the Easter Rising of 1916, a revolutionary event which led to Irish independence. This oral history collection, to which I've referred, contains individual stories of both the sung and unsung heroes and heroines, very importantly, of that chapter of our history. And that digital collection was a striking reminder to me of how the availability of digitization has in many ways democratized the study of history, allowing for a wider participation in its production and a wider gathering of memories, one that brings new perspectives to events of the past, allowing history from below. For universities and archives, digitization then has opened up exciting possibilities, enabling new ways of generating, curating, and engaging with information. It allows for innovative modes of research and broadens the reach and effectiveness of scholarly communications. I think too of the collection of the archives of national theatres, public broadcasting archives, and how they can be accessed by newly connected scholars. And in the case of purchased archives that have flown abroad, they can make their way back, as it were, through the new technology and through digitization. They can be great benefits to contemporary scholars. And more broadly, technology has a great liberating potential in a world which is experiencing greatly increased mobility and displacement. One of the most exciting dimensions of the potential use of technology by scholars and students for higher education is that indeed, as you have heard, it liberates learning and the advancement of knowledge from the constraints of national borders, supporting international partnerships, facilitating cooperation which is imperative if we are together to address the many global challenges facing us. At the same time, in the context of this information revolution, I am conscious too of the continuing importance for society of the university setting, of the need to critique the domain assumptions about the teacher-student relationships, and of the need to analyze the nature of digital usage as a private or as a socially shared experience. The implications for speech, oratory, clarity, and, if you like, important clarity of expression, adequate presentation. These are immense, and in all of these areas there is cause for concern in Europe at the moment. In some ways, a diminished capacity for discourse has ushered in a new form of aggression, occasionally relieved by cliché when it draws its breath. Such questions take on a heightened importance in a contemporary world where universities are challenged to adjust to more complex and pluralist society, prompting further questions about the nature of the university itself. I say, as a head of state, what can universities be appropriately requested to deliver for society? What should not be expected from them? What is their role not now, but in the future? Much of the literature on the future of higher education in the digital age has been almost apocalyptic, predicting the transformation of the sector by quote, the forces of technology and globalization, the United Kingdom's Institute for Public Policy Research warned in its 2013 report, it gave it the title, An Avalanche is Coming, Higher Education and the Revolution Ahead. And it went on to say, the solid classical buildings of great universities may look permanent, but the storms of change now threaten them. Outlining the threat posed to traditional 20th century universities, if key institutions don't change radically, they identified what they called the entirely new models of university, which are seeking to exploit globalization and the digital revolution as the new competition, the real threat. And Ernst & Young, in their 2012 report a year earlier, had given their report the title, University of the Future, a 1,000-year-old industry on the cusp of profound change. And it suggested that digital technologies have transformed media, retail entertainment, and many other industries. Higher education is next. The suggestion of a moral panic comes to mind, that rapid response is demanded, and within existing models of economy-society connection, wherein, if you like, lies its most fundamental flaw. This language requires critique. How similar it is to the hubris of the moment of the arrival of television battles for the coverage of short or abandoned World Bank reports on education being, as the World Bank put it, the next big thing in Africa. Quantity delivered with a kind of heretical enthusiasm for action, without any consideration of form, culture, or ancient and indigenous rights. I think it is important to reflect on the sources, the assumptions, and the purpose of the discourses from which these dramatic views have emerged. It is difficult, for example, to find in them any influence of social policy theorists, philosophy departments, social economists, or indeed those engaged in fundamental theoretical work in science. Similarly, the political climate and the assumptions and the political climate of the day, it does indeed influence academic possibilities. You cannot afford to ignore that. There are interesting examples in the discipline of applied economics, for example, which tell us something of the importance of the political atmosphere in which you seek to develop your work. Werner Reitman and Markus Schweiger, for example, have written how the fortunes of two great Austrian intellectuals, Paul Lazarsfeld and Friedrich von Hayek, differed. Hayek's business cycle research found a political support and could migrate, and on the other hand, it had an immense recyclable influence as well. Paul Lazarsfeld's sociology, on the other hand, did not find such favorable setting and languished. Standing back of it, one can see how the policy emphasis of the day was contributed to the success of the one in Hayek's case. But equally, one can see also how the policy of the day defeated the empiricism of Lazarsfeld, which raises a fundamental question as to where empiricism lies. There is a grave danger that debates about the role of the university are taking place in a narrow political and ideological space. Today, higher education worldwide has certainly moved from the periphery to the center of government agendas. With which aspects of our university have government policymakers concern themselves, and with what consequences, and what benefit, and for whom? That should concern us all as citizens in Europe. I suggest that at the present moment in Europe, and far beyond it, insofar as policymakers focus attention on education and policy, they tend to view universities in a rather utilitarian way, as foundations of new knowledge and innovative thinking within the confines of existing trade, commercial, and economic paradigms. Paradigms that are fading and dying not without damage to social cohesion. Existing sources of policy options then pursued, perhaps often with the best of intentions, their own project, rather than any, if you like, purposive change as a means of advancing social justice and mobility. They seek contributors to a social and cultural dynamism, irrespective of the distribution of its benefits. And this is an approach wherein short-term concerns will always prevail over long-term development or even social cohesion concerns. And my purpose this morning is then to suggest to you a recall of some of those first principles of the necessary role of the university in society. Principles which I suggest should set the parameters within which we can most productively engage with the new technologies and reap the dividends of innovation. Principles by which new technologies might strengthen rather than undermine the intellectual foundations of Europe that have been carved out over so many centuries, and principles that might remain as vision, however now threatened as they are, as a possible future for our European citizens. In doing so, we must recognize that we live at a time when the language and rhetoric of the speculative rather than the productive economic space has become embedded in the educational culture and has brought some university practices down a precarious road. That reductive view has brought us, I believe, to a time of great questioning about the purpose of the university, much of which has been corrosive, and perhaps we have arrived even at a moment of intellectual crisis. The university state debate is in its extreme form sourced in a view that is based on an erroneous perception that the necessary focus of higher education must be on that which is utilitarian and immediately applicable. Such a view sees the primary objective of the university and those who study within it as being in preparation for a specific role within the labour market, often at the cost of the development of life-enhancing skills such as creativity, analytical thinking, and clarity in written and spoken expression, which might enable the citizen of the future to make the choices of life-work balance, choices of that life-work balance which are so important, choices as to what is beyond survival, and also assumptions as to what is really meant by human flourishing, by solidarity, by humanity itself. We have now reached, I believe, a juncture which sees intellectuals challenged to recover the moral purpose of original thought and emancipatory scholarship, a time when we must seek to recapture the human and unifying capacity of scholarship. I often refer in my speeches to Max Weber, the great 19th century social theorist who responded to the events of his time in the second half of the 19th century, as he saw it as a public task of an intellectual, accepting the requirement not only of radical thought, but of the duty to communicate it within a public discourse. Weber's was a time of radical change and transition, the response to which would be dominated by technocratic thinking. I haven't time to deal with how this is dealt with by the Frankfurt School and by Adorno. But Weber supported a commitment to rationality as the key building block of the future. His was not a mission to reject the rationalist heritage of a previous century, but to look beyond that horizon to something that was beyond logic, intuition, and religious sentiment. He critiqued the excesses of both positivism and idealism, but envisioned the consequences of potential abuse of that which would claim to be rational. He foresaw the consequences of irrational thought and action, hiding behind the masks of acclaimed rationality or some bogus inevitability. Weber spoke movingly of the threat of a spring that would not beckon with its promise of new life, but would deliver instead a polar night of icy darkness. He prophesied an iron cage of bureaucracy, a dehumanized landscape with which conformity would be demanded to that which no longer recognized its original moral or reasonable purpose. And while Weber's view of the future might be seen as dystopian, we can certainly recognize some of the features he predicted in our contemporary situation, in which acclaimed rationality has led less to what is productive or inclusive, but at so many times to what is speculative gambling on resources and outcomes, and that has had consequences in so much global misery and has placed social cohesion at risk. Our contemporary European crisis is at least as profound as that faced by previous generations of political and social theorists at the end of the 19th century. But our response seems to be so slow, even as so many European citizens sense inadequate. The bucket rattles up from the well of European intellectual thought. We are left thirsty for theoretical or policy or visionary possibilities. The crafting of a response to this crisis is, I believe, a widespread challenge, and one which the Irish and European universities should embrace, insisting on remaining open to originality in theory and research and committed to humanistic values in teaching. After all, we must never forget that it is through the encouragement of creative and free thinking that our universities acquired their status in the past, and correctly claim it today as unique institutions that accept the responsibility for enabling and empowering citizens to participate fully and effectively at all levels of society. This creative function, this creative guarantee must be cherished, nurtured, and encouraged. Too many, perhaps unknowingly, have accepted what I suggest is an under-labourer view of the university, indeed of intellectual work. Put more broadly, as we seek to belong in a form of society-economy relationship where we've lost the capacity to critically evaluate and where we witness the many great crises currently facing Europe, citizens yearn for the evidence of activity, of engaged critical interdisciplinary work. Be the arrow, not the target. That was the title that the critical theorist Raymond Williams gave to his last address on communications. We European citizens, I suggest, cannot allow ourselves to be the dependent variable in a fractured dialogue on the future of the European Union, simply quiescent observers of the role of a declining international solidarity. We cannot allow ourselves to sleepwalk through the crisis that an unaccountable but reformable form of globalization presents at a larger level. In this context, the role of the university in enabling citizens to develop the intellectual tools to address the great challenges of our time, which include questions of development and global poverty, of climate change and sustainability, and of conflict and displacement and refugee movement, is one which is vital. And indeed, that we have heard the call to be responsible in relation to climate change or to sustainable development, that it has been endorsed by world leaders, is due to responsible scholars, and they should be proud, thoughtful scientists who have made the intellectual case for political action and did so publicly, and who refuted those who had vast resources to seek to dislodge their science. And they did so at the global level, combining scholarship with citizenship and activism. In this wider social understanding then of the university, its relationship with its students cannot, in my view, without great loss be reduced then to that of provider of any narrow professional training, guided towards a specific and limited objective, and essentially disengaged from the academic experience, which is fundamental to independent thought and scholarly practice. Theirs must be a much broader rapport, one which introduces students to an intellectual life and allows them to develop a critical turn of mind, as well as informing an ethical concern with their community and their planet. At the pedagogical level, then, the increasing availability of online courses has done so much to make further education accessible to a wider range of citizens on our planet. It presents exciting opportunities for increased participation, especially among remote or marginalized communities. It is critical, however, that students do not become disengaged from the teacher-student experience. Learning from those who are passionate about their subject, face-to-face collaboration, regular engagement in organic debate through discussion, through university societies and clubs, journeying into the false avenues as well as the fruitful ones. That is central to a rich and fulfilling educational experience. There are great challenges in contemporary research practice as well. In the published research in the social sciences, with which I would have been familiar some years ago, we have witnessed in recent decades the marginalization of political philosophy and social theory to rather narrow issues of administration, and under pressure of publication and preferment and peer competition to that which can be easily measured. More and more pressures come on universities and scholars to prove their relevance within a hegemonic version of the connection between society and economy, a connection that is destructive to social cohesion, one that has demanded a consensus on the desirability, not merely of an economic growth measured in the gross terms, but of a singular limited version of the teaching of economics itself. Scholarship requires the breadth and the breadth of culture for paradigm shift to happen. And those subjects should be located within a cultural field. And as a research subject in itself, the role of the state as innovator or generator of social cohesion has to be recovered. Analysis of the role of the state has faded in recent decades of political research, and not accidentally. It has given way to applied studies in an administrative sense of the state's action, allowed to describe, not allowed to question. These studies may be important in themselves, but they are insufficient to a normative discourse on values such as solidarity, interdependency, shared vulnerability, and community. Such a necessary normative discourse has given way in the popular social science literature to a discourse on lifestyle and individual consumption. That is not accidental, for we have been living through a period of extreme individualism, a period where in its early extreme version, the concept of society itself has been questioned. The public space has shrunk to being presented as a competitive space of consumers and investment for consumption rather than citizens. That is the mark of our times, the hegemonic version of the model by which it is suggested we should live our lives together. And neither can there be any doubt that one of the contributing factors of our recent economic crisis was a failure of capacity and intention on the part of our citizens, as well as government, as well as our institutions, to question, to scrutinize, and to interrogate the forms of individualism to which they were invited and to which they responded. That they were invited to aspire to, the insatiable consumption to which they were induced, and which not all of them, but a select number, who had access to income, and which over recent decades were accented and prompted as alternatives to any models of public good and welfare, perceived and presented such notions of the public good and welfare as old-fashioned, out-of-date, old collectivist thinking. Our existence was assumed to be defined as one of successful or unsuccessful competing individual actors, at times neurotic in our insatiable anxieties for consumption, as Zygmunt Bauman might have put it. Within the social sciences, we can identify also, from their response to current circumstances in Europe, a model of separatism, generating statements from, as it were, different silos not in touch with each other, that leaves us with an approach that is not sufficient at either an analytical, policy, or normative level, and in which essential connections between different spheres of social and political discourse and life have become fractured or even lost. I'm coming to the end and to suggest this thing. The reconnection of theory and practice, and the reconnection of the discourses within philosophy, science and technology, and the social sciences, of ethics and economics, is now an urgent priority, as is the reconfiguration of analysis and policy. The will to build, to create bridges, and to listen to each other too with respect, which has become fragile. They remain as critical in the academic sphere as it is in all areas of life. When scholars are prepared in their pursuit of knowledge and solutions to engage in inclusive and interdisciplinary scholarship, to take a broader perspective and to learn from the viewpoint of others, We can, as a society, only benefit from such an approach. Indeed, even at the economic level and more practical level, we must also be mindful that the workplace of the future will have to be a space of creativity, crachiocht we would call it in Irish, and it will be one that will need graduates who are creative thinkers, able to bring disparate ideas into a coherent whole, bringing that broader understanding to complex matters, and engaging in the production of integrated solutions, holistic solutions, engaging with intuitive intelligence, upon which so much scientific discovery is based, as much to scientific advance and discovery, and it teaches us. Walter Isaacson has said that science gives us the empirical data and the theories to tie them together, but humans turn them into narratives with moral, emotional, and historical meaning. And thus, within university settings, any abandoning or relegation of the humanities in our academic institutions will in the future be seen by future generations, I believe, as a betrayal of the purpose of education. If we wish to develop independent thinkers and questioning, engaged citizens, our universities must, while providing excellence in professional training, avoid an emphasis that is solely or exclusively on that which is measurable and is demanded by short-term outcomes. They must allow for the patience and the peace that is required for memorable university teaching and research. And you will all have examples of that in your memory. And what I'm outlining then is not a simple question of any wasteful competition between the humanities and sciences. Rather, in a complex world, I suggest, we are called to understand the necessary relationship between the liberal arts, the foundations on which much academic learning must be built, and the fields of science and technology in an integrated approach to learning. Indeed, throughout history, the best of our scientists have merged scientific endeavour with the arts, creating a common space in which the best possibilities na féidirachtaí could be realised. We do not now, nor will we all agree, no doubt, on it, but fostering the capacity to dissent is another core function of the university. Third-level scholarship has always had and must retain a crucial role in creating a society in which the critical exploration of alternatives and refutation to any prevailing hegemony is encouraged. Universities must surely be facilitated and supported, made free and funded, so that they may preserve their role as special places for the generation of alternatives in science, culture, philosophy, politics. Universities must be places where minds are emancipated and citizens enabled to live fully conscious lives with joy, in which suggested inevitabilities are constantly questioned. And if this is to be achieved, the importance of primary and original research is necessary. I have quoted here in this university before from the second Gleon Declaration, Universities and the Innovative Spirit of 2009, which suggested that it is in our universities that, I quote, the leaders of each new generation are nurtured. It is there that boundaries to our existing knowledge are explored and crossed. It is there that unfettered thinking can thrive and unconstrained intellectual partnerships can be created. It is there within each new class, within each new generation, that the future is forged. These are words worth repeating and remembering, and words which remind us that it is the duty of the university to engage in shaping and not simply reacting to the fourth industrial revolution. Neither technology nor its potential to disrupt are remote extrinsic forces over which we as humans have no control. All of us, as members of a global society on a vulnerable planet, must play our role in guiding the pathway of new technology into our society in a way that is ethical and moral. It is essential that public citizens' support for the necessary public investment in universities is secured, and that the benefits from this investment are retained within the universities themselves and demonstrated to a supporting public. The university must not be considered simply as an external purchasable component of the marketplace, as it cannot exist in its fullest sense in an exclusively market world. The intellectual dimension of higher education is not one that can easily be measured, and universities must not be called upon, I suggest, to be judged only, performed solely in ways which lend themselves to comparison by metric measures of performance that are at least contestable. Digitization, I say, Marfockelsker to finish, has great possibilities for the effecting of positive transformation within our society. However, as with all the tools of power, the ethical test is its biggest test. The test is in its use. In our current circumstances in Europe and the world, it is here, in our universities, that we can begin to enact such transformative thinking as is necessary to create the foundations of a society that is more inclusive, participatory, equal, peaceful, socially cohesive. That transformative thinking will require a real change in consciousness. It is through critical and engaged pedagogy, kindness and the exchange of knowledge, that we can be assured that we're engaging the educators of a generation that will have the capacity to understand and question the assumptions of any status quo, and to understand when that status quo must be challenged, and how a generation who will have the confidence and the wisdom to engage in alternative versions of what a society can be, and to bring it into existence. I suggest that the universities and those who work within them are crucial citizens in that struggle for the recovery of the public world, for the emergence of truly emancipatory paradigms of policy and research. Our contemporary European challenge is not merely a case of connecting the currency, the economy, and the people. It is about recovering the right to pose such important questions as Immanuel Kant did in his time. What might we know? What should we do? What may we hope? As the universities reposition themselves in a global, connected and more culturally diverse society, they must seek to deliver their capacity to deliver a creative consciousness, participatory citizenship, recognizing both the positive and liberating potential of technology and the critical role of emancipatory university learning in enabling us to connect the possibilities of an unknown future. Connect ourselves to those possibilities, or Frederick the Gonchore. May I wish you well for your conference and for the continuing vital work of your association. Thank you.